On this day in Seventh Day Adventist history, January 12, 1861. Now the year was 1859, and there was two evangelists, J. and Amos and John Loftworth. They went to a small little town about 30 miles to the south and west of here called Parkville to hold tent evangelistic meetings. Now incidentally, it was J. and Amos who brought down Loftworth to the Sabbatarian Adventist Church. Now they're working together. Well, their tent evangelistic meetings opened on August 9, 1859. They ran until September the 4th of that same year. During that time, they had 38 meetings, so obviously they had more than one meeting a day. From those 38 meetings, they had 20 converts to the Seventh-day Sabbath. Now notice I did not call them Seventh-day Adventists, because that name would not be chosen for another year. Well, those 20 converts, they decided to organize anyways. So they organized under the name of the Parkville Church of Christ, Second Avenue. Well, had an organization, they had 20 members, so they thought, well, let's build a building. So they bought a lot in Parkville, Michigan, and they put up a simple structure. It had 2 doors in the front, 3 windows down either side. Well, coincidentally, this is that building. It was constructed in 1860. It was moved here 140 years later in the year 2000. Well, by the time the building was up, the name Seventh Day Adventist had been chosen. So they decided they wanted their church dedicated as a Seventh Day Adventist church. So they wrote to the Review and Herald and said, please invite everybody to come to Parkville, Michigan, January 12, 1861. John Loftworth agreed to come back that day. James and White, they agreed to come that day. Joseph Harvey Wagner went on to become editor of the Signs of the Times. He agreed to come that day. Another man that did show up was a man by the name of John Byington, who 2 years later became the first General Conference president. Well, Joseph Harvey Wagner had the dedication sermon that morning. James White stood up and he had the dedication prayer. And then it says that Ellen White stood up. She gave a strong message to the congregation. When she got done and went and sat down, she went into a vision. Now, James White would do something kind of strange when his wife would go into a vision. He would invite people to come up and examine her. Well, in the back of the building that day was a man by the name of Dr. Brown. Now, when Dr. Brown had heard that this Ellen White was coming to Parkville, Michigan, he bragged all over town. If this woman ever goes into a vision and I'm around, I'll snap her out just like that. Well, James White had given the invitation. Dr. Brown was in the rear of the building, and everybody else in Parkville had heard this boast. So they turned around to him and said, Dr. Brown, now is your chance. Well, James White, hearing there was a doctor in the house, that excited him. You know, he's like to have medical people examine his wife when she was in vision. So he said, please do come forward, doctor. Well, it says that the doctor came about 3/4 of the way forward, boldly, and he stopped. And the color started to drain from his face. Well, James White, not knowing the rest of the story, nor of the boast, came down off the platform, put his arm around the doctor's shoulder, and encouraged him to continue the examination. Which he did. Then he broke out into a cold sweat and tried to exit out one of the doors. Well, the people of the church, they weren't going to let him out until he did what he bragged he was going to do. So finally, James White says to him, so doctor, what are the results of your examination? And he stammered out, Elder, her heart beats, but there is no breath in her body. You see, when Ellen White would go into a vision, she would not breathe. There's times they put a candle or a mirror even over her nose and mouth to show that there was no air going in and out of her body. Well, by this time, the other members of the church, they're getting a little antsy, and they go, Dr. Brown, do what you said you were going to do. He says, I can't. Well, why not? Only the Lord knows. So by this time, he knew he was fighting against something he could not win against. Well, Ellen White was in that vision for about 20 minutes. The good doctor didn't exit from the church at that time. When she came out of that vision, she stood back up at this very desk right here. She looked out at the congregation. She said, I've had a vision of a war. A war like this country has never seen before. She said, I was shown men in hand-to-hand combat and dead and dying men lying all around. I was shown prisoner of war camps where there'd be more men just wasting away. I was shown families that would lose fathers, brothers, uncles, cousins, and sons in that war. And then she looked out and she says, and this very building will lose sons in that war. Well, also in the congregation that day were 2 officials of the Michigan Republican Party. One was a judge by the name of Osborne. The other was a very wealthy millionaire by the name of Mr. Jellos. Now they knew that South Carolina had succeeded from the Union already, but they may not have known that the preceding 3 days, 3 other states, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, had also succeeded from the United States. So they didn't think there'd be a war here in the United States. No, they thought the Union Army would go down there, they'd strike South Carolina, they would join back up, there would be no war. John Loftworth, who was sitting in the front, he saw these men kind of look at each other, and then they looked in the front. Kind of shook their heads and smiled like this woman doesn't know what she's talking about. Well, let me tell you, this woman did. Because 3 months later, to the day, shots were fired at Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began here in the United States. On this day, January 12, 1861, Mrs. White had the first of her visions of the Civil War.